Hello and welcome to Share.care's What is Manly radio show and podcast. Men feel more lonely, lost, and not useful in society than ever in history. Males are not attaching to school, work, or women. What it means to be a man appears lost. Is there a framework for being manly that we can unearth?
Welcome to Share.care, an all-inclusive community sharing experience, strength, and hope to create strong, healthy, and inspiring relationships. Share.care communities work toward every individual feeling safe, valued, and heard, free from the threat of danger, pain, or harm. Each episode, founder Damian Andrews explores the principles underpinning Share.care and invites expert special guests to share their knowledge so you can easily reap the benefits so many others experience. You hold the choice to create your future. Let it be with strong, healthy, and inspiring relationships.
Hello, Brad. How are you?
Good, thanks, Damien. Good to be here with you again.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you back on the show. And for the audience, we have Brad Mewhort. Now, Brad is on a mission to prevent male-on-male violence and end physical bullying. He believes that men healing from violence and finding peace within themselves are the key to enabling humanity and all of life on Earth to flourish. And he wrote the book, The Peaceful Man. So welcome, Brad. Do you want to start, because there's a lot in the media at the moment about men being lost, lonely, not feeling like they have a purpose in life. Do you want to start more broadly as to what you've seen in that regard, and then we can narrow it down to some specific actions that people can do to move forward?
Well, I do think that the expectations and the definitions of masculinity and what is manly has at least, well, in some way has evolved a great deal over the last several decades.
Yeah.
But in other ways has not evolved so much as just been shaken up.
Right. Okay.
You know, a lot of these kind of stereotypes of men, expectations of men, of being strong, of not showing emotions, of is being very contained, and the expectation in traditional society, in a sense, that they're the breadwinners and that's kind of all there is to who they are. That's their identity. And that has really, I'm going to say, in many, many regards, is not working the way it did in decades past for a lot of men, for a lot of people. And certainly for some men, I think that has evolved, and there's new definitions, excuse me, of what it means to be manly, definitions of masculinity. But that hasn't kind of caught up with all men. So I think there is a great deal of confusion and feeling lost and a struggle with this evolution that hasn't yet been an evolution for everyone.
Because I was going to ask that. It seems to be that there's a lot of confusion as to what men should do. Is that, I mean, part of that, and it sounds like it's not that there isn't a willingness to do that. There's just confusion as to what is right. I mean, if we go back, there was some fairly clearly defined roles that people had. And whether that was right or wrong, that's not the debate we're in. It's more that people had a clear definition of what to do, so they knew what to do. Now it seems to be there's a lot more variety in what you can do, but people are not sure what they should do. Is that right?
I would definitely see that as being at least a major aspect of it, yes.
Yeah. So I mean, is it a case of we need to, because it I mean, this idea of, men connected with strength, um, is that, when you say, is that evolving? Is that something that needs to evolve? Is that, has that changed?
Well, I think it does need to evolve on a couple of different levels.
Yeah.
And one is just, you know, as a result of so much having changed already. And I will say, the liberation of women that
Mm,
has happened has really changed the expectations and the roles of men. And so, in some sense, those traditional roles, as a result of the liberation of women, to the extent that it has happened, uh, men need to, in a sense, find new ways of being, new definitions of masculinity, new ways of being manly, finding new meaning in that, because what it used to mean just doesn't work anymore. It doesn't exist. And in some sense, I would say that uh, the in some sense, I'm going to say, there's a way that men have not been liberated from their traditional roles, even as much as women have been liberated from some of their traditional roles. In some sense, women can, in kind of conventional terms, they can choose to go to work, or they can choose to stay home with the children, or they can choose to do both. And for some men, certainly some men can feel they have those options, but it's still, at least in kind of from some conventional perspectives, not manly to, say, be a stay-at-home father or something like that. So, in some sense, I would say there is, just for there really to be true equality, uh, and actually, and when I'm saying that true equality, in some sense, I'm going to say it's going to more fully liberate women as well, if
mm,
men are liberated to be a stay-at-home father without that, the negative judgments coming in about themselves, potentially from their female partner, from society. So on that level, I do see it necessary for that evolution to happen, just because of what has happened already.
yeah. So do you still think, from what you're seeing, that that is the case, where it's expected that the man still goes out to work, and not be a stay-at-home dad so much?
I don't think that's universally I don't think it's universally unacceptable. There certainly are people who have more open perspectives on that, who welcome that. There certainly are men who are at
Mm,
least open to playing that role. And I think there are still a lot of people with kind of more traditional, more conventional, in a sense, older older perspectives from earlier decades that persist. So
mm.
I certainly wouldn't say it's a universal, and it those old expectations, I think, still exist for many people, in many groups, in many cultures.
What do you think is the challenges overcoming those hurdles to be able to do that, make that shift?
Well, I think the biggest one, in a sense, is culture.
Mm,
That it's what, as males, and I think it's changing in younger generations, but hasn't completely changed, this idea of what it does mean to be a man. We learn that. We learn that from our fathers and our grandfathers, and then even from our our peers, that knowledge is kind of shared, being hard, being the breadwinner, being tough, being strong, boys don't cry, these types of things, and there's also, and I think this is actually um uh, a well, demeaning of women, but also demeaning of men. These ideas of, like, it's uh, that certain activities are girly, or and things like that.
Do you think from that perspective, I mean, because when we're talking about making that shift, I mean, part of, if I understand correctly, part of the reason, women went out to work was it was seen as lesser to be at home. So they were, coming out. So now what we're doing is creating that shift where we're expecting that guys take a step back to being what women didn't want to be because it was deemed as lesser. Is that part of an issue that needs to be overcome somehow?
I would think so. The idea that raising children is lesser. I think that's problematic, regardless of gender.
Yeah. And I mean, how do we overcome that from that side of things?
Well, again, culture, and I would also think that, in some ways, the programs of government and in the legal system and in companies of, and I think this is the laws and support around this, I think, are probably a lot better where you live, Damien. But here in the United States, for example, the policies for maternity leave, let alone paternity leave, are quite minimal. And I
Mm,
think, that creates there that creates a culture. There's a lack of valuing of the importance
yeah.
of parents being with children, for example.
Mm. If we take the framework of power as the ability to act, which is it is, and which is that's the definition of power. But if we add to that, money has gives you ability to do different things. Certainly, if you've
Definitely.
got more money, you can do more things. To
Sure.
put it in that context, and so that's I just want to put that framework around. When I'm referring to power here, I'm not talking about it's power over someone. It's a power of
Right.
ability to do that. Do you think part of that cultural, shift, or the lessening of working at home, being a stay-at-home parent, is partly because someone that goes out and earns money has the ability to do things with that money, whereas someone that stays at home, yes, developing a child I'm a parent. I know how valuable that is,
Right.
um, and I spent a lot of time making sure I was available to do that, yeah, and I had the ability. My circumstance enabled me to do that, but you don't get paid for that. So it doesn't, as much as you're putting a lot into development of a child that's going to go out into the world, it doesn't give you that power in a sense of being able to go because you're not getting paid for that. Do you think that's part of the reason why going out to work is deemed as higher on the cultural stigma of achievement?
I think it probably is. I think that's probably a big part of it. And a way that I like to think about uh, what I might describe as real power, as opposed to power over someone, which I think is kind of an illusory power, in fact. But to really have power in your life is to be able to make your own choices and
Mm,
choose. And in some sense, and certainly having more resources gives people more options, more choices. And culture also does that.
yeah.
Our culture and our identity, those also can restrict our choices of what we really want to do. So, while certainly yes, I think you make a very good point about money. I think that's only it's only one piece of it, and
Yeah.
an important piece of it.
Yeah, so that's what I was, because I was just wondering from that perspective, is we want the equality, from men to be able to stay at home, but we're asking them to say, hey, you can do less essentially. Unless, I mean, does it come back to having to have a harmonious relationship where both parties are working well together?
Definitely, definitely.
Yeah. Because I'm just trying to work out how we do that if we're creating that equality where, I mean, obviously with some legislation and being able to, I know men have maternity leave now in Australia, where they're
That's
able to stay
wonderful.
home. Yeah, where so they can stay home and still earn income as well. For I'm not sure what the time period is, but from that side of things, I'm just trying to work out how do we get people to you know I mean, I know I said it's difficult for me because I was in a unique position where I could balance both quite well. I had my own business, so I was able to be flexible in how I did things.
Right,
But not everybody has that. So when someone's in that circumstance where, and especially when money's important, look at that. If you're struggling to pay the bills, that's a pressure that people might go, well, I want to get out there and earn money to be able to take that pressure away. I mean,
right.
how do we find that balance?
It seems to me in some sense that solving, finding that balance on on the level of all of society, regardless of economic status, is really uh, we need to address much bigger problems in a sense, which
Mm,
I don't feel I necessarily have the answer to, but it almost seems to me that this is a the difficulty of balancing this, for everyone,
mm,
such as you were able to do, really is a symptom of larger problems in that I think we're globally grappling with.
yeah. Okay. And so from that, if we go back to this stereotypical masculine figure, uh, which I find interesting because I mean my background doesn't include that. When you look at it, it's the tough man, the fight, that fight mentality.
Mm.
Um, yeah, and that bravado where there's that attack, and that's what your book is about finding a peaceful way through that. Do you want to talk us through that? Because from my experience, I was posted to the SAS, which is Special Forces in the Army. All those people were quite capable of fighting, but
Right,
unless it was an extreme circumstance, you would never know. They just had a quiet confidence about them, and then which links back to a number of, again, with my son doing martial arts, his sensei is very much about it's defense only, it's more about self-control, that kind of thing.
right.
And it seems to be, and maybe it's because like attracts like, and so they're the type of people that I've associated with. But I know that out there is that, that tough guy mentality that you've got to be able to, do it yourself, do it alone. Is that what you're experiencing with, and was that part of what your book was addressing?
Part of it, yes,
Mm,
and I would, that's certainly it's not this. Well, let me actually start with I think that the as males we have testosterone,
yeah,
uh, the we have aggressive impulses as the
mm,
result of that,
yeah,
which is not in and of itself unhealthy. There's all kinds of healthy ways of that being expressed.
mm,
There's beautiful ways of that being channeled and used and as a service to ourselves and to others.
Mm.
And if there isn't healthy expressions of that aggression, healthy ways of relating to it and dealing with it, then it's very easy for that to come out in violent ways, in harmful ways, in destructive ways to self and to other. So I do think that that male aggression, which often is villainized, just as a default, that this male aggression is bad, and it's like,
Mm.
well, first of all, I don't agree with that, but secondly, to whatever extent, even to grant someone, okay, maybe it's undesirable, but that's not going to change 50% of the population of the planet
Mm.
from experiencing that, because they have, because their bodies produce testosterone. So in some sense, I'm going to say that's a reality of being a male, being within humanity, is that there are aggressive impulses that come up for males.
Mm.
Now, I think that the that those impulses, those aggressive impulses becoming violent, I think that very much is learned, and
Mm.
I think that often, uh, you know, especially if a boy has been a victim of violence
Mm.
from family members, from peers, from whoever it is, in a sense, that's a way of they learn, and this very much happened to me. Uh, a learning that being capable of violence, or even being violent, is
Mm.
how to survive. I need to be capable of violence and willing to use it in order just to be safe.
Yeah.
This kind of unfolds in the culture where there is violence. And
Mm.
I would say I wouldn't go so far as to say I never initiated violence, but I would say I did it very little. My learning, in a sense, it was, I would say, healthier on the spectrum of things, but very much, along, what you were saying about your sensei teaching your son in martial arts. My kind of, uh, I was more ready to defend myself when I encountered violence than I was actively violent. But I can also see that for some boys, even some men, that being violent with others, initiating violence, is a way of showing that they are capable of violence, and to, in a sense, keep themselves safe.
Mm. So it's from that, is that having that confidence to know that if you need to, you can defend yourself?
I think it can be that, and I think that, uh, well, we're not going to completely eliminate violence anytime soon. So certainly having people who are
Mm.
capable of violence, but also very capable of not using it, and knowing and being uh, very aware of when it's necessary, and when just simply the potential of it is a sufficient deterrent, and just being very restrained with the violence that they're capable of. I think that's very essential in
Mm.
the world the way it is right now. Idealistically, I would love for humanity to reach a point where really just even having that capacity for violence was not necessary. That our collective, our individual and collective trauma had all been resolved to the point that there were just no violent impulses that there was no spreading of violence, that really we were just in a much more peaceful equilibrium. That would be beautiful, and I don't see us reaching that point anytime in the coming decades. Maybe much further out than that, if it's possible at all.
Where do
So,
you
yeah,
go ahead?
that's okay.
No, I was going to say, where do you put sports within that? You know, for some sports, there's the competition, there's that element of you know, that that excitement from that. I know and it's different, but it's one of my favorite. It's, I don't know if you classify it as sport. They do call it a sport, but it's is battle bots, where they set these robots together and they fight each other, and there's some excitement about that. Where do you put that? If we're talking about this utopian society, this game theory where you have that that competition level of sparring with each other, so to speak.
Mm. So, yeah, I'll just jump right to. So
Mm.
I think that there's there's some gray area with sports, which have a fairly high degree of violence
Mm.
uh, in them, and I can see different perspectives on it. I'm not very familiar with these robots fighting that you're talking about, but I think a good example from my perspective is American football.
Mm.
And in some sense, I have concerns and reservations about the degree, and calling it violence might be going a little bit far, but how uh, but the way in which physical aggression is expressed. I mean,
Mm.
they're wearing helmets, but they're smashing heads over and over and over again, such that many professional football players are, actually are experiencing the long-term effects of brain damage
Mm.
from just repeated, uh, in a sense, repeated minor head injuries for years.
Yeah.
So that, I have concerns about that. I have reservations about that,
Yeah.
especially, uh, just, and in some sense, I could say, okay, if someone's a professional football player, they're being compensated for that. They're an adult choosing to do that. But there's a lot of 10-year-olds out there playing football
Mm.
also. And granted, they don't have the same force behind them, and yet what are the impacts of this? So I have these reservations, but then on the other hand, I also, I mentioned earlier that, yeah, as males, we have aggressive impulses. And in some sense, uh, maybe there could be certainly arguments that American football goes over the line of what is reasonable, but sports in general,
Mm.
ways of being active, ways of engaging with each other, being competitive with each other, that is, I would actually consider a very healthy form of aggression in general. That's a great way of exploring that, expressing that, experiencing teamwork and competition with others. I think that's all very healthy and necessary ways for us. And to to a large extent, I think even just being a spectator of
Mm.
sports has not the physical benefits, but many of those similar outlets and ways of connecting around cheering for a team. So all of these, I think their sports are necessary in some way, and actually very healthy, great ways of expressing aspects of our humanity, and we do have some violent sports which I think kind of are. I wouldn't go so far as to say like there's anything that I'm like wholesale opposed to, but there's things that go far enough along that I have questions about them.
Yeah, and you raise a very good point there too, especially, I mean, if you've got adults getting in and, take it to the extreme, the running man, so to speak, if you've got two willing adults that get in there and go for that kind of thing, you know, I mean, obviously, there's certain people can have various opinions on that, but the point is, are we clearly educating young children as to, this is, something that you need to consider here. You butting heads for a long period of time, have you thought through? I mean, at 10, it's not really something you're going to be thinking through, but certainly the parents should be considering that. And I know that there's a lot of parents that do consider that. There's a lot of parents that play, in the global term football, but we call it soccer, where they choose soccer as opposed to some of the other sports because of the non-contact for children.
Right.
How do we draw the line and explain that, because as you're talking about this aggression, there is that level of testosterone. The recently, just in the past week, we had the Australian inline hockey championships. Wasn't ice hockey, but it's roller hockey, and I did some interviews with the teams there, and it was really interesting. I didn't know this beforehand, but actually, a lot of the teams are so there's men and women in the teams, and the guys were very forthright, saying the women are actually a bit more aggressive in there, which was really interesting. But what was interesting that they said that they were able to get out there, and when they played, they went really hard. Like they would knock people on their asses. In their terminology, they get up and they go hard. They were going for the win, and as soon as they got off the field, they said it was all back to being, best friends. So it wasn't this rivalry that continued off with sledging outside of that kind of thing. How do you, and I put that in context too, to when I did go-kart racing, there was a guy I used to race with and we raced hard. I remember one race, we're racing go-karts 100 kilometers an hour, or was it 60 miles in your vernacular? And got to clarify.
Yeah.
But we were belting into each other and we come off and all our side pods are crushed in and things like that. And we got off. As soon as we got out, we went up to each other and go, "Oh, that was awesome." And we were patting each other on the back of how that competition was going. How do we draw the line there as to go, okay, in the game we're doing this, but we know how we've got the maturity, so to speak, that when we step out of it, it's not personal. I mean, how do we educate, especially young people, that in the game, yes, you want to strive and push really hard, but when you step out of it, it's a different thing. How do we set those parameters or framework?
Yeah, I mean, what you're describing, it sounds very healthy. There's a container for how this competition and how the aggression can be expressed, and there's even within the container there's limits and rules,
Mm,
uh, and that all sounds uh, you know very healthy, and I think that is just the education of
mm,
this is the container. This is where these things can be expressed. You can do things here in a sense that you wouldn't just walk up to someone on the street and do. And even inside this container, there's agreements in a sense, rules, but really the
mm,
rules are agreements for how you're all going to play together. And it I'm actually reminded of I played hockey growing up, and one time I think my team lost because of the a bad, from my perspective at the time, from my team's perspective, a bad call that the referee made.
mm,
And I was angry about it, and I got home and I was stomping around, and I was still angry about it. And my dad
mm,
told me, you like, this is fine in the game, but the game's over. You can't bring this home.
mm.
And I actually think that was uh, a good message, a good teaching for me, is that it was in the game. And um,
Yeah.
not to bring that outside of the container of the game.
And I love that you went there, because that was a question I was going to ask you is, because your dad said to you, he said, that was in the game and you don't bring that home. Is that from the perspective of, do we need more of that at home, that teaching at home, saying this is, does it need to start there? And how do we do that when you've got some, parents that might not have that view?
So definitely, I think it should be happening at home, uh, and I totally agree. It's not happening in all cases, and I think that's a big challenge. It is
Mm,
really really difficult, and certainly some of that can come through teachers at school, coaches on teams, etc.
mm,
And in some sense, if it's not coming through parents, that's where it needs to come from. Perhaps it can come through, different role models as well for different sports, etc. Um, and I certainly think that it coming from the parents is most potent, where it most needs to be coming from, and it doesn't always come from there.
Is it a case where we need to just have more discussion about this for, the parents do this and then it becomes the parents that aren't doing that? Because we, as people, we are societal, and we move towards what the group is doing. Well,
Right.
humans follow the group. You just have to look at any, it's generally. And do we just need more conversation about this is really what it's about, and then others will fall in line.
I think so, and I think that's an evolution that will happen over at least a couple generations, if not longer than that.
Mm,
I think like many things, I don't think there are quick short term solutions as much as I wish there was. I think it's a uh, looking at it in terms of a slow evolution, and actually I could just zoom that out a little bit about this whole conversation
mm,
about what is manly, and this evolution of what masculinity means, what it means to be a man. Certainly we're I think many of us are grappling with this and looking at this and aware of this.
mm,
And we might find, we certainly evolve within ourselves, find new definitions, new ways of relating to it. And ultimately, I think on a cultural level, the on a collective level, that evolution takes generations to
mm.
really fully unfold.
Is that part of it because we generally operate from habits, and as we start, certainly as we get older, we get more set in our ways of those habits, and rather, not, and this one, I'm linking it back to being open and listening. We kind of we stop listening as we get older.
I think that's part of it, and I think that we were cultured by what we grow up in ways that is very difficult to see. That as much as we look at something, we're looking at it through the eyes that we've learned to look through.
Yeah.
And so that's one aspect of it. And the other is, I think our most potent learning comes from our parents, and talking about masculinity, being manly. For most of us, it's probably our fathers who we most learn that from. And for those
Mm,
boys not growing up with fathers, that's obviously not coming from their father, but in a sense, that's a problem
mm,
as well, perhaps even a bigger problem. And if we're not, if someone has a father, if a boy has a father who is let's say, kind of locked into these conventional types of perspectives, these from decades ago, on some level that's going to be learned, and it's going to
Mm,
be a slow, for the boy becoming an adult, becoming a man himself. There may be some redefinition of that, but
mm,
it might be his son before there's really kind of a fresh perspective on that, a fresh teaching of that. So I
mm,
think many of these changes in any one person, in any one generation, we see increments of change and not revolutions. And that's not to say that revolutions don't happen for some men in some places, but looking at all men globally of
mm.
this evolution, I don't see the revolution happening overnight for all men everywhere.
Yeah, yeah. It takes time for that to filter through, as you're saying. With
Exactly.
for what is manly, putting a framework about that, where does failure sit within that? Because it seems to be, I look at it, people seem to, equate failure as not succeeding, whereas it seems to be guys need to have that, hey, fall on your face and get back up. And I had that in another example with my son. Early on, when he was doing his martial arts, he wasn't doing the training, and I could have sat there and jumped on him and said, "Hey, you need to do it." But I thought about it and said, "Well, I'm going to sit back, and when everyone else grades and they're going to get their next belt, and you're not," and I let him go through that. And yeah, he went to the grading. Everyone got their next belt. I think it was the yellow belt. It was a while ago, and he didn't. He got said, "No, you didn't do it." And then we walked out, and I said, well, "How did that feel?" And he hated it. And that changed his perspective. But how much do we need to accept that failure is okay? It's what we learn from it, and especially from a man's perspective.
Yeah, in some sense, the learning failure on some level being okay, and also learning to learn lessons from failure. On some level, I don't think there's very much about that that's specific to men as
Mm,
opposed to women. I mean, there's something that seems actually very important to just being a human about that.
correct. Yeah.
The one thing and I think some, uh, from for some men, I think there is shame, and it's probably really for some people, but I think there's particular potency for some men about failure being unacceptable. It's showing weakness, and
Mm,
that's probably
that's
what actually is unacceptable from kind of this conventional masculinity perspective,
mm,
is that failure is weakness and is therefore unacceptable.
yeah. Is that? I mean, and that's the part that I'm getting to from a man perspective. Failure is a weakness.
Yeah.
Um, and is that? I mean, that's what I'm trying to say. That failure is actually not a weakness because one, we don't know everything anyway. So how can you not? If
Right.
you're trying something new, it's the beginners suck, as they call it. When
Right.
you start something new, you're going to be poor at it. And you just got to suck it up and move forward, as they say. Or in a case of a man up, and go, hey, I need to give it another go. Do we need to be having that discussion with young boys and men to say, hey, it's okay to not succeed the first time you try, and even the 10th time. It's whether you quit and don't, if that's something you want to do, and then you give up because you can't. Is that what we need to be teaching guys?
Yeah, and you mentioned discussion, and I think discussion of that is important. And I think just the examples and we, the way that men live their lives individually to influence other men and boys is really even more important than that.
Mm,
And I think what you're talking about gets into, well, could it brings up for me, what really is weak and what is strong.
Mm.
Um, and that really brings me to the word vulnerability, which I think is something that from conventional perspectives
Mm.
is seen as weakness, especially uh, emotional expression, emotional vulnerability is
Mm.
seen as a weakness in men. It's not masculine. It's not manly. It's man up, boys don't cry. These types of things.
Yeah.
And myself, I actually take almost the opposite perspective from that, from what is conventional. My perspective is that, especially because of these stereotypes and what is conventional, that a man who is able to cry and willing to cry in front of other people, that is very vulnerable
Mm.
and courageous.
Mm.
That to me seems like real strength.
Mm.
And that is in a sense, that might be, if we were to keep the and well, we could have the argument that, in definitions of masculinity, we should even try to, put aside this idea of men are supposed to be strong, that there's an association with masculinity and strength. But my inclination is actually to keep that, like, okay, masculinity, there's still a strength that's an ideal in it, but the strength isn't to hold it all together, to have all the answers, to never fail, to never cry, to never show emotions. The
Mm.
strength in masculinity that I admire, that I aspire to, is to be emotionally vulnerable, to be willing to share my emotions, to share my challenges, to share my failures, to express myself emotionally, to be able to cry, to have the full range of human experience, and to be able to share that with, at least with those who I love and trust.
Mm.
And that to me is is the version of masculinity that I admire and aspire towards. And I would love to see that as an ideal of masculinity propagate a lot more in culture. And and I think that's happening. And but it's far from universal at this point. And I think there's and at this point, I don't even think there's a strong cultural definition of that. And I think that some of that, um, a fair number of us are kind of defining this for ourselves and creating a new culture. But I think
Mm.
that has a long ways to go to really fully permeate into the culture.
From that perspective of, and I love the term that you used, show the full range of the human experience, because there is something to be said for that. If you have, a man up front giving a speech and him showing that he's affected by that in an emotional way, that's very powerful, extremely
Absolutely,
powerful. Um,
absolutely.
and where do we draw the line? It was interesting, something I didn't know but learned recently was that hysteria actually is from the womb, is its
Mm.
origins. Um, and maybe that's not a good definition, but where do you draw the line of going, okay, uh, it's important to ask for help when you need help, but at
Yeah,
some point too, if you're a leader, where do you draw the line and saying, "Hey, I don't know," and I love I have these little snippets from movies that inspire me, and one was from U-57 with Harvey Keitel and Matthew McConaughey, and Matthew McConaughey's just become the ship's captain because the captain got killed. and he'd given the speech about he doesn't know what he's doing. And Harvey Keitel, when they're alone, says, "Hey, can I just have a word with you?" That you in summary saying, "You don't you ever say that to the men that you don't know because you're the captain now, and you saying that you don't know is going to just kill the morale." And that, I'm paraphrasing slightly or a lot, but that's what he said. Where does that line get drawn from that perspective of if you're the leader to say, "Hey, I don't know where we're going"? I mean, isn't that the definition of what a leader should do?
So I think there's a lot of gray area in that.
Mm,
In some sense, I think that expectation of a leader to know what they're doing and that they're in charge and that they have everything figured out, that is that's that older conventional perspective
mm,
where the leader was not supposed to be vulnerable and uncertain. And that said, if there is, um, people do want to be able to trust the person they're following. So I think it's a fine line there between being willing to be vulnerable and uh,
mm.
demonstrating the competence to actually be a leader. And in some sense, you might say that knowing when to be vulnerable and when not to be vulnerable is a skill of good leadership.
Is that a case of and I love the terms that you used there, where you said knowing where you're going, but also you mentioned having it all figured out. And I'd be, I think, I mean, if you even look at many of the great leaders in that are throughout history, they probably didn't have it all figured out, but they had a clear direction. Is that
Right.
the difference?
I think that's an important aspect of the difference. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think, another aspect to it is just simply, there's making a decision, having the confidence to make a decision, and also being able to say, "Oh, I was wrong. Let's change direction."
Yeah, that's an important point you're saying about being able to admit that you were wrong. I mean, we look at that with certainly there's some leaders that come to mind at the moment that have made some fairly poor decisions, but
Right.
won't ever admit that they were wrong, and they're just doubling down.
Right.
Um, is that? I mean, how do we show boys and men that being able to say, "Hey, I made a mistake," is actually strength, not weakness?
I think demonstration in the way we live our own lives. And by doing that, by living that,
Mm.
one one act at a time, we can change culture. And it's a slow process.
And if you made a mistake, is it? I mean, if I'm just thinking through this as you're talking about it as well. You've made a mistake and you don't admit that you're wrong. Essentially, you're living a lie, and a lie is not a place of strength.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And something, another just talking about, qualities of leadership and being a good leader and ways in which it's moments to be vulnerable and not in that. I
Mm,
think another, in a sense, at least slightly vulnerable leadership quality is to ask questions, even if someone is a subordinate in whatever context someone is a leader in. Being able to ask them questions to realize that person may, at least right now, know things, know more than I might as the leader. And that
mm,
there's in at very least information they have. They may have uh, recommendations, and being able to ask for that rather than thinking, "Oh, I just need to have it all figured out as the leader, being able to ask, and ultimately, it's the leaders, but then also being able to hold the leadership, like, okay, we're going to follow what you're recommending, or we're not going to follow it, and being able to own that, but not be locked into thinking that I just have to have it all figured out and nobody else.
Is that, I mean, from that perspective, because that would seem obvious, that, you know, no one can know everything.
Right.
It's just, and not only because things move, things evolve. Even if
Yeah.
you did know everything today, tomorrow something will have evolved and you won't know. Is it that case of, from a manly perspective, it's having that ability to listen and ask questions? Is that a trait that we need to be encouraging more?
I think so. I think so.
How do we do that? How do we, get people? Because and I know I was very guilty of it. When I was younger, when someone's talking, I'm busy thinking about what I'm going to say next, as opposed to really listening. I mean, how do we teach people that listening is actually strength?
Well, again, I think the biggest thing is just demonstrating it, doing it ourselves.
Mm,
And uh, that is, I think, very much a skill in some ways, that certainly there's cultural evolution there, but it can also be learned as a skill. I think that, through there's all kinds of practices that that work on explicitly this, things like nonviolent communication, authentic relating. These are practices that are potent for really learning this.
mm.
So, this is something that I actually think we are seeing that change a lot, and we could continue to see that change quite quickly. I hope.
Yeah. And do guys need guy spaces? Because I think, I mean, have we lost a lot of that where, if you, I mean, there's women's only gyms, and this is not a, having creating a gender war in that sense. It's just an observation. But if there's a
Right.
men only gym, it becomes, well, that's sexist. Have we,
Right.
because of that attitude, have we lost? And I've heard a lot of women say that men need to have their man time with other men, but as a society, have we lost that because it's, in a lot of cases, it's seen as being sexist?
Right. Yeah, I think there is value in having spaces which are, just dedicated to one gender.
Mm,
And I think it's unfortunate, exactly what you described. It comes to mind that, I mean, my wife and I climb, we would rock climb and climb at a gym, and my wife actually organizes a women's climbing night.
mm,
And I mean, that's wonderful. It's a great opportunity for, women to connect and climb together. It's, I'm going to say climbing is, uh, not dramatically, but slightly skewed. More men do it than women. So I certainly see the value of having a space for women climbers to climb together.
mm,
And I was just recently thinking about you, but there's a social aspect to that. It's difficult for me to imagine there being a men's climbing group,
mm,
because just as you described, there would be probably be someone who interpret that as gender discrimination. And in a
mm,
sense, I don't think the climbing gym where we would go would even want to venture into that territory where they might be accused of that.
mm,
So, certainly there are very intentional men's groups.
mhm,
I think in a sense there's not really even a shortage of men's groups where men, for men who want to come together and process,
mm,
but not all men want to do that.
yeah,
Not all men are seeking those kind of uh, deep type of vulnerable ways of connecting that generally happens in a men's group. They might just want to get together you know, do whatever they do a sport together, etc. And certainly groups of friends still do that. That still happens. And
Mm,
there's not a lot of formal groups, which are uh, men socializing together in a
mm.
in a lighter way. And so I think that is something that is not as common right now as would be ideal.
Because I look at it from that perspective. I mean, and again, I was kind of, I think I was fortunate. Maybe it was because of the culture at that time, and that I was lucky enough to have good male role models. But when I was younger, you know, in my, before I was 10, I'd go out with my dad played social golf, and that was just men going out and playing golf at different golf clubs. But I'd go with my dad, and then I'd be paired off or plotted off, how we wanted to, group of four, with a whole bunch of
Right.
other guys, and each week it'd be different guys. So I'd get these different perspectives, and it was all very respectful. I don't recall anything that was misogynistic about these guys. And similar sort of thing happened a little bit later in my early teens. My dad was playing lawn bowls as well, did the same thing. And I had these really great mentors. Now that I look back at it, when I'm really thinking about it, there was a lot of guidance where it was just men advising, gentlemen advising a young boy. This is how we do it, playing the ball, playing the sport. But there was undertones to that of, this is how we deal, and learning by example, so to speak. I do wonder whether men need to learn more from example as opposed to having a discussion about things. Um, and that's where I'm wondering, from that perspective, have we lost a bit of that? Because I look at it again from my personal life. One of my friends, organises, when the Grand Prix here in Melbourne, um, for over 20 years now, he's organised a Grand Prix party. Now, it's not specifically men, but every now and then, someone's partner will turn up and she will never come back, because we're not censored. And again, it's not misogynistic or talking about derogatory women. The analogy that I put forward before is, we're holding each other's head and farting on it, and it's not physically happening, but as an analogy,
Right.
we're guys just being guys. And similar sort of thing, we have a poker night, and now my son's coming to that, and it's just guys getting together, uh, telling fart jokes, ribbing each other, a bit of that verbal rough play. It's not physical rough play,
Mhm.
and sparring with each other in a way. And that's why I'm wondering: do we need a little bit? Do guys need that? Do they need that rough play? Rough housing would be the right word.
I think it's a great question, and I actually have a question for you about that. Just what you just described. You mentioned guys being guys,
Mm,
and how much of this behavior you're talking about? How much do you think is, let's say, in our genes as males,
mm,
and how much of it is what we've learned in culture about what it's, how we show
mm,
up as
mm.
males? I'm curious what your perception of that is.
Yeah, because that's an interesting point that you raised, because and maybe the way I've described it, it seems like we're all the same, but in part of the group we've got very effeminate gay men, part of that.
Mm.
And it's so they're not the typical macho or anything like that style. And we all have our own, it's a very open and welcoming environment where, but it's more, it is the it's so it's not physical roughhousing, because we're playing poker, for example. We take the poker night, but there's a bit
Right.
of verbal, jibing of each other, stirring each other up, trying to get someone to get a reaction out of them. It's all very friendly. There's nothing. I don't think anyone's ever crossed a line where it's been insulting. Um, it's so yeah. And that's where I do wonder: is it is that behaviour, when you look at it, is it something that's learned, or is it, part of that release of testosterone? I'm not sure on
Mhm.
that, but it's from a diversity point of view. There's certainly very diverse people that behave very differently, have very different opinions. People there, it was interesting. Hadn't really noticed, but how many people actually don't drink, which
Mm.
is an interesting thing. So we're here having a poker night. There's people that are drinking quite heavily, others not drinking at all.
Mm.
It's an
Yeah.
interesting dynamic.
Yeah.
So I do wonder,
Yeah.
from that perspective, what of that is learned, and when I look at it from my perspective, what was learned, and what is it part of that release of testosterone, even though it's not a physical release, it's a mental release. Is that
Right.
part of what we need?
Yeah. I'm curious about that question often, is, how
Mm,
much of, and certainly in the context of being a man, but even in other contexts as well, how much of the things we do, the ways we are, what we perceive, what we experience in how much of that is our genetics, and how much is what we've learned, uh,
mm,
uh, and perhaps even learned that it is because of our genetics. It's because we're a man. It's because we have testosterone, and maybe it is, and I'm sure
mm.
in some instances, yes, it is. And even, and I guess I would say, and really, I don't see it being an or thing. I see it, all very much
Mm.
coming together. There's ways we learn to express um, the testosterone aspects of being a man, and there's ways we've learned that, and so there's cultural aspects to it, even if there is something fundamental to uh, to being a man there as well.
Because I mean, I wonder about, and it's for me, it's because I grew up. My mum was very influential in my life. I mean, I did all the women's stuff around the house. I had to make my
Mm,
bed, I did the dishes, all that kind of housework stuff. So I grew up doing that, even to the extent I don't remember this, but one time my mum dressed me up in girls' clothes. My granddad hit the roof apparently. It's like you don't do that. But so it was very much involved with the stereotypical feminine activities in the
mm,
household, which I probably attribute that to how I helped with my interaction with my dad. But same token too, as I mentioned, my favorite sports are NASCAR and BattleBots because I love the aggression in that. But again, it's in the game.
right.
You don't take it outside of the game. Um, you know, it's
Right.
so I wonder how much of it is genetic, how much of it is in the
Yep.
DNA where we have that testosterone. We need to release it, but we need to have as a number of people in martial arts that I know, they say that the warrior mentality is the warrior uses their strength to prevent war, not to
Mm,
create war.
beautiful.
Um, you
Yep.
know, and that's where I just wonder from that perspective is that, and that seems to be a tradition from um, because it's something I struggled with. I'm Polish, Ukraine, and Russian, so I can, and I feel I'm already integrated, so I think I can help over there. But
Right.
both grandmothers were Polish, and so they really set the tone in the household. And Polish is Catholic, so and
Mm,
as my dad said, his granddad was always what your mum says goes. So they went to church.
right.
And so I grew up with that Catholic upbringing, and one thing that I always found odd was the saying, "The meek shall inherit the earth." Because the Bible is in anything but meek. It's like,
Right.
robes are draped in blood, all that kind of stuff. So it just seemed, to go, this is what you needed to do. This was how, it operated, that all of a sudden the weak would inherit the earth. But I later learnt, and I've got a pastor who lives across the road from me who confirmed it, that meek originally from the Greek meaning was actually great power under control.
Mm,
So, which is that's a totally different dynamic when you're looking at it. It's not someone who's weak, it's someone who has great, again, coming to that thing, the warrior creed is to prevent war.
right.
Um, and I'm just wondering, is that, because when we look at it, have we got lost? Because, I mean, the Bible's not it's an old book, it's been around
Right.
for a while. Was that there originally and we lost that?
Yeah, I do see, putting this into my own terms. I described uh, the form of strength and masculinity as being willing to be vulnerable, as
Mm,
being what I admired and aspired to. But I would say another aspect of that is some kind of a protector
mm,
function, of what kind of my my ideal of what masculinity looks like going beyond our conventional definitions of that, our
Mm,
traditional definitions of that. And certainly being a protector was an aspect of those kind of traditional perspectives on it.
mm,
And that's actually, um, I think that's actually something valuable in those kind of conventional, traditional perspectives on it. And I think that in the conventional way of a man being a protector, it tends to be quite, um, the spheres of
mm,
what the man is protecting tends to be fairly limited.
mm,
Family, uh, community, country, and that's kind of would be the different spheres of identification that a man would most be likely to identify himself as being a protector of.
mm,
But some of those, and certainly being a protector of the family, that remains important, and to some level even certainly community, country. But I think those need to be extended
mm,
to a protector of life, the planet. What uh, Taking a larger perspective on what we're the protectors of. Really feeling even responsibility for the full community of all of humanity, all of life on Earth.
yeah. Do you think from that perspective, I mean, maybe with this whole boys don't cry, that kind of thing, we the message got lost for
Mm,
some people in the sense of, I mean, if you're in the moment, let's take an extreme moment. If you're in a war situation and you're fighting a battle and someone, hits you, you know, and you go and you start crying, that's probably not going to be good for your survival.
no.
And but same token too, if you've got an injury, you want
Hmm.
to be able to get that fixed so
Right.
that you can, and I mean, and it was kind of a little bit biased in the sense of when I was in the military and in the special forces, the people that I was there with, everyone was screened. We all did psychological tests beforehand. So, and they all had a certain personality which knew how to ask for help.
Mm,
Now thinking back about it, I hadn't thought about it at that time because all the people there were very, very capable. At the same token, they had no problem expressing concerns, expressing their feelings, expressing
mm,
that they needed help or asking for help. But again, so that's a kind of a biased situation because everyone was screened before they went into that. And that's where I'm wondering, have we lost that in the sense of, in the moment you need, like we mentioned before about the inline hockey, they get out there in that container, they go hell for leather, but as soon as they walk off, it's
right.
back to that. Do we need to have that more about that discussion for guys?
Yeah, and I think I'm. There's so much that is context dependent too. I
Mm,
mean, I described how I really admire and aspire towards being vulnerable and being able to express emotions and things like this. But that's not to say that uh, I aspire to do that or hope that others will do that in every moment. There's
mm,
all kinds of situations where that's just not appropriate, not called for,
mm,
or taking you mentioned the extreme example of like being in battle.
mm,
That's just not that's going to be detrimental in
mm,
those circumstances. So I think some of the skill set of being vulnerable is really to know to be aware of the context for
mm,
when that's appropriate and when it's not. And um, yes, I want to be able to be fully vulnerable and express whatever I'm feeling with people who I'm close to, with my wife, for example.
Mm.
And that's not to say that's what I'm doing with everyone, not by any
Mm.
stretch of the imagination. There's all kinds of contexts where that isn't appropriate. Appropriate is, that's not even the right word, that it's not of service
Yeah.
to myself or anybody else. So I
Mm.
think that's some of the skill set that needs to come with with learning to be vulnerable, with learning to be authentic, that doing that well in a healthy way, in a way that benefits yourself and other people. That's not just it's not a skill to just vomit that all over everybody. And I mean, and sometimes I think for some people, there's a bit of a learning process with that when they start discovering, oh, I can express myself, I can be vulnerable.
Yes.
That there's sometimes a process there, and I think occasionally someone kind of gets stuck in that. But
Mm.
in general, I think that learning through that of appropriate context is an important part of the process.
Yeah. So that word that you used there was awareness.
Mm.
Part of that is, having, I said, I've been fortunate whenever, when I was growing up, I've never had a problem asking for help. I learned
Mm.
quickly that you need to be careful who you ask for help. Sometimes some people, it might be good intentioned, but, they might not be good at giving advice. Is
For
that
sure.
is that a case for men to have these safe places where they can, ask for help, where they
Yeah.
know who that is, having those mentors? And so I was fortunate. I had lots of great mentors where I was able to ask questions, and that was okay to ask questions. So innately, I grew up with that.
Right.
The
Right.
same
I think
token
at the
too.
very least, safe people.
Mm. So is that, and I guess that's swinging back to these men's groups again. Do we need to have a bit more of that, where it's, there is that
Yeah.
guidance from older people, older men to younger men.
Hmm.
Someone was telling me recently about a study. It was an animal study, but they took the male elephants out of the older male elephants out of the environment, and then they
Mm.
found all these other animals were being killed, and it was the younger male elephants that were doing it.
Oh
Um,
wow.
and then when they put the older males back, all of a sudden it was like there was this guidance as, yes, you are very strong, but you don't go and, you know, stomp around on everything.
Right.
Do we need, I mean, and this is where I was wondering from that perspective, has this whole, and I understand where it was coming from, that we needed to have a bit of a balance, but did we swing too far on the pendulum and say, well, we men do need good men guidance?
Absolutely. And I think that uh, there's a balance between, well, I think this in a sense is true of humans in general, but perhaps specifically talking about men right now, the older generation to be these mentors, these the teachers, to hold boundaries, to hold principles in certain ways, and to uh, provide guidance and a framework for younger generations. And there's also uh, we also need the younger generations to bring and fully embrace and live new ideas to change culture.
Mm.
So I think there's a dynamic interplay of those,
Mm.
and that's really essential to have a really healthy and evolving uh, thriving across the generations.
Mm. It seems to be, there's some real fundamental traditional things that were there that may have got lost, and that's
Yes.
probably where we need to be going back to with that. My
Yeah, and I
respect,
would say
honor.
there's some traditional things that we've held on to that we might be better off losing. So I think
Yeah.
there's a mixture there of
Mm.
some of the traditional things that are still very present and are not serving us, and some very important traditional things that, are maybe not entirely lost, but that are scarce.
Yeah. Well, Brad, I know you have to go soon, but if we to sum it up, what would you say some of the key takeaways for men listening to this as part of that guidance if you're feeling lost and lonely? Some things to practically they can do to help get back to finding their way.
Well, I think there's a few different things. I think, becoming aware of how they have the culture that they've learned about what it means to be a man, and to be willing to question that and
Mm,
understand that there's an evolution going on, and to some extent that I think that many men are in an unfortunate position of really having to grapple with this on
mm,
their own and come up with their own definitions more than would be ideal in many cases.
mm,
And along those lines, I would certainly encourage them to reach out. There's lots of men's groups, mentors, all kinds of places that they can get support. And
mm,
as an aspect of kind of moving beyond some of these conventional definitions of masculinity, I don't look at it as being unmanly at all to ask for help, to ask for support. I
yeah,
think that is something that, having the courage to ask for and seek out that support and receive that support, that shows a lot of strength, vulnerability, and what I would call masculinity.
yeah, definitely,
So I
and
think those would be the
intelligence.
couple of major things. Yeah,
It's, you don't know something, asking for help is an intelligent thing to do.
exactly. Yeah.
Brad, it has been wonderful having you on the show. I know you got to run, but thank you very much for making the time and being part of this and sharing what is manly.
Enjoyed the conversation with you, Damien. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being part of the Share.care community and helping people around the world prosper. You're creating a bigger pie for everyone to share. The more people contributing to the world being a better place, the better the world becomes for others and for you.